Alan Sanders from Nevada stood by the second-floor window of the old house where he kept his work materials. Spread out on the table were photographs of demolished cities and notes on recent conflicts. His hands clenched a worn folder containing documents that confirmed his status as a journalist, but he had no intention of using official channels. He wanted to go to Chechnya incognito, to find something there that, in his words, neither federal nor foreign television could show. His past included numerous unauthorized trips to war zones. He had often been to Iraq and Afghanistan, hiding from official structures and gathering information by illegal means. Now he felt that Chechnya required the same approach. His family warned that a fierce war was underway in that Russian region, and that it was dangerous for foreigners. They said he might not make it out alive, given that kidnappings in Chechnya had become an unsettling statistic. He refused to listen. Standing before that window, he recalled the circumstances under which he had nearly died once before. 6 months ago, he'd been driving at night on a narrow road about 40 miles from Manchester. The road cut through forested areas. It was cold inside the car, and he stepped out to stretch his legs. He heard a rustling a few yards away and shone his flashlight. A wolf sprang out of the darkness, though they weren't known to live in that area. The animal sank its teeth into his neck. The pain was sharp, and it felt like an inevitable end. A passing patrol officer happened upon him, unconscious, and rushed him to the nearest clinic. Later, Alan tried to figure out where the wolf had come from. According to official data, no preserve reported an escaped predator, nor did anyone find any tracks. The hospital staff confirmed that the wounds were consistent with the bite of a large animal. The doctors barely saved his life. After surgery, Alan spent 3 weeks in a hospital bed, wondering why he felt less fear in his soul and why a strange energy had appeared inside him. Sometimes he felt surges of aggression, but he attributed them to the after effects of stress. When he returned home, his wife Betty noticed that Alan had begun acting strangely at night. He would get up and go off into the darkness as if driven by some unknown impulse. Sometimes he returned at dawn in filthy clothes, with no memory of what he had done during those nightly wanderings. Betty tried to talk to him. She feared that the wolf bite had affected his mind or triggered some psychological breakdown. The doctors suggested that his profession and the horrors he'd witnessed were the cause of his sleepwalking. They insisted he needed medication and rest, but Alan disagreed. He felt he couldn't just stay put. Tension within the family grew. Betty begged him to think more carefully about his new assignment. The reports coming out of Chechnya terrified her, and the television footage made her shudder. Federal troops were fighting rebels there, and various groups frequently abducted foreigners. Alan understood the risk was high, but he was convinced that the true picture of the war lay hidden beneath layers of propaganda. He believed that only a direct look at the events could help him write a powerful and honest piece. Arguments at home became routine. Betty pleaded with him to stay. She reminded him how he had nearly died in England and how he could now die in the Caucasus Mountains. She refused to believe he was ready once again to break every agreement they had. Alan responded that the job could provide them with financial stability. After all, the newspaper was prepared to pay well for unique information. He didn't reveal his plans in detail, only hinting that he would travel with caution. He didn't want to tell his wife just how dangerous his ideas really were. He intended to reach Grozny discreetly, relying on old contacts and the money he had set aside from his previous reports. Several times he dreamed about that night in the English forest where the animal had attacked him. In his sleep, he heard the predator's growl again and felt the tearing of his flesh. He woke up in a cold sweat, realizing that the fear wasn't as strong as it should have been. By then, he was used to that state, in which the line between despair and an internal fury seemed blurred. He decided he would no longer hesitate. In the morning, he packed his backpack. He took his voice recorder, a spare lens, his laptop, and transferred part of his funds to a separate account. His passport lay in a hidden pocket. He understood that official documents could cause problems at checkpoints, but he took them just in case. Betty, standing in the doorway, tried once more to beg him not to go. He only asked her to take care of her own health. He knew she wouldn't accept his decision. She reminded him of their years together, of the difficult times they had survived, and of his recent hospitalization and his nightmares. Alan gently touched the scar on his neck and said he did not want to stay on the sidelines of a war everyone was only talking about from a distance. An hour later, he left for the airport, then took a flight to Moscow with only one goal in mind: to get to Chechnya and see everything with his own eyes. Alan reached Chechnya by roundabout routes, changing vehicles several times and covering nearly 100 miles on broken country roads. He got out by an old concrete ruin, where a short man named Kazim was waiting. Kazim had a dusty Niva with a cracked windshield. They didn't linger at the deserted intersection, but immediately headed toward Grozny. Alan sat up front, placed his backpack between his feet, and quietly said he'd come on a mission to do a story about the war. Kazim didn't reply. He just gave a brief nod and pressed the gas pedal. A sinister emptiness greeted them at the entrance to Grozny. Burned-out car shells lined the road, brick walls gaped with holes, and rusted frames of former shops blended into the heaps of debris. Alan tried peering into the windows of the ruined buildings, but saw only dust and rubble. Kazim kept driving carefully, slowing for turns and checking his mirrors. Alan decided to ask if the central part of the city had suffered the most. Kazim answered softly that the troops had bombed from a distance while the militants fired back, sparing no structures. He said the streets had once been full of people, but were now nearly deserted. A few yards farther, they turned down winding side streets. They passed the remains of a high-rise building with dangling staircases. Kazim stopped by a rusted archway, pointed to a collapsed facade, and explained that there had once been a large department store here, now reduced to ruins. Alan pulled out his camera and took a few shots. He knew that the overall picture was far more horrifying than any single photograph could convey. He had seen wars before, but the scale of destruction here was staggering. As they drove on, Alan listened as Kazim recalled life before the war. He mentioned that the city used to have movie theaters, fountains, and amusement parks. People strolled around with their children, buying pastries from street stands. He said his wife loved riding the small Ferris wheel, which was now nothing but twisted metal rods. Kazim spoke with bitterness, sometimes pausing to focus on the road. He didn't like remembering the past, but couldn't forget how bombs had destroyed everything. Alan asked why he blamed the Russian troops. Kazim replied that it made no difference to him who was doing the shooting when civilians were the ones dying. He emphasized that he didn't want to see anyone with weapons on his land, but fate had decided otherwise. After crossing an intersection, they passed a few local residents. Two stood by a half-demolished wall smoking, while another stared warily. Alan realized they regarded him with suspicion. Kazim calmly said, "People don't trust outsiders here. Everyone's tired of the military, and you're a foreigner, so keep a low profile." Alan nodded and put away his camera. His status as a journalist meant nothing. Here, even less could get you shot. A few minutes later, 3 men suddenly surrounded the car. They asked Kazim something in rapid-fire Russian, but he answered with barely a couple of words. The strangers stepped aside. Alan understood he was in a zone with no rule of law, where anyone they met could be armed. The conversation then shifted toward Kazim's family. He admitted that before the war, he'd been head of security at a facility, earned good money, and was raising 2 children. His parents lived in a small house a few miles from Grozny on the hillside. When the bombing began, Kazim tried to evacuate his wife and kids through the mountain passes. Their car came under fire, and no one but him survived. He never found his family's bodies, and later learned that his parents' home was completely destroyed. Kazim said death had become commonplace here, but the pain of loss didn't fade. Glancing at Alan, he confessed that at first he hated all outsiders, but now he needed money, and taking risks had become the norm. He was willing to drive journalists or anyone else, as long as he got paid something. Alan listened, recalling recent conflicts where he had witnessed refugees losing their lives. He thought about how Chechnya seemed steeped in hopelessness. As the car turned into another courtyard, Alan noticed several pairs of eyes watching from shattered window frames. Kazim said people sometimes asked him for small favors, like giving them a ride or getting fuel. He indicated that the war had turned him into a guide for people like Alan and many others who needed to move around discreetly. When the sun began to set, Kazim suggested they stop at a hiding place. He mentioned there was a checkpoint ahead that could demand their documents. Alan knew he had very few official papers, and the soldiers might respond with gunfire. He looked at the rubble in front of him, realizing every turn in this city was fraught with danger. Kazim killed the engine and said, "We'll head out again in the morning." Alan agreed, knowing that the main thing now was not to attract attention. The night promised to be restless. Early the next day, Kazim woke Alan with a light tap on his shoulder. They had spent the night in a half-collapsed building, sheltered in a spot where the fallen roof offered at least some protection from the wind. The cold seeped through the cracks, and the smell of dust and old soot made their throats burn. Kazim motioned for silence, saying he could hear unfamiliar voices nearby. Alan stood up, feeling pain in his neck where the wolf had once left its mark. He tried not to think about that incident, focusing instead on the new day. They stepped outside and spotted a military-style vehicle. Kazim whispered that it might belong to a local militia group, since it had no identifying marks. After a quick look around, he suggested skirting the checkpoint through the backyards. They moved cautiously among the debris until they reached a ruined road near which stood a huge portrait of Djokhar Dudayev. A bit farther on were the remains of the presidential palace. Kazim pointed and said, "This used to be an important square." Alan stepped toward a gap in a wall, trying to photograph the rubble and part of the portrait. His heart sank as he imagined the historical significance this place must have held before the bombing. Suddenly, a UAZ whipped around from a narrow alley, blocking their way. Two masked men jumped out with rifles at the ready, ordering Kazim to stop and hand over his documents. Kazim gave them some paper, but they immediately started talking about suspicious persons. Alan realized there was no point trying to reason with them. Their demeanor betrayed aggression, not a willingness to talk. One of them lunged at Kazim, striking him in the side with the rifle's stock. Kazim staggered, unable to utter a word. Alan reached toward the pocket where he kept his papers, but instantly heard a shout, "Don't move! Hands up!" He raised his hands, but in the same second felt a sharp shove in the back. He was forced into the UAZ while someone else rifled through Kazim's pockets, snatching his keys and some small bills. Alan heard another man bark an order to get out of here fast. The third gunman, his face almost entirely hidden by a mask, kicked Kazim, spat out a string of insults, and dragged him to the vehicle. Alan noticed how tightly the man gripped the rifle, as if looking for an excuse to shoot. He wanted to shout, to try to explain, but the response was a blow to the head. For a few seconds, his mind went blank. He felt himself tossed onto the back seat, a weapon pushed against his chest. The air reeked of smoke and sweat. A wave of fury swept over him, but it was useless to resist. Alan closed his eyes as the UAZ jerked forward. Above the engine's roar, he thought he could still hear Kazim's screams. He too had been thrown onto a seat nearby. They bound Alan's legs with rope and tightened plastic ties around his wrists. His head throbbed and his spine ached from the jolts over the broken road. After a few minutes, the vehicle turned down a side street. Alan couldn't see where they were going, but it was obvious these men were not just soldiers. They had their own base. His attempts to speak up were met with coarse, "Shut up," orders and blows from rifle stocks. Finally, the car stopped at a place that looked like an underground bunker or an old warehouse. Footsteps echoed around them, along with the clatter of shifting crates. Alan barely opened his eyes as they dragged him down a steep staircase. The room was low and damp, lit only by a dim lamp in the corner. Alan tried to spot Kazim, but he could see only someone's feet and a gun pointed straight at him. A curt command rang out, "Sit down." They slammed him onto a hard chair, slapped a wide strip of tape over his mouth, and bound his arms behind the backrest, tying his legs as well. He wanted to scream, but the tape muffled him to a faint moan. The door slammed shut. The owners of this makeshift prison remained somewhere beyond the wall. Alan thought he could hear cursing in the next room, but he couldn't make out the words. Dust mixed with the smell of gun oil, and the air was heavy with moisture. Kazim seemed to be held elsewhere. Alan couldn't hear him and had no idea if his guide was even alive. A deep sense of despair began to swell. After several minutes, the door opened again and a shaved-headed man came down, holding a camera and a plastic water bottle. He glanced at Alan and sneered, "American fool." Then he splashed water in the prisoner's face. Alan jerked back as the water trickled down his chin. The man ripped the tape off his mouth and introduced himself as Abdul. He said he would soon record an important video, and if things didn't go as he wanted, Alan would regret ever coming to this country. Alan sat there in the damp basement with his hands tied. His back was stiff from being forced to sit so long. The cold concrete wall pressed against his shoulders, though he knew it was really just the feeling of terror closing in. After some time, Abdul returned, wasting no time on conversation. He opened fire with a pistol, aiming at Alan's leg. The bullet tore through fabric and skin, unleashing a fierce pain. Alan screamed and curled up as best he could, but Abdul only smirked. Lifting the camera, he warned that each bullet would reduce Alan's chances of survival if the ransom wasn't paid. Then he roughly bandaged the wound with a filthy rag so that Alan wouldn't die too soon. The camera recorded a short clip in which Alan, pinned in a corner, was forced to announce the captor's demand. He spoke about the need for $1 million or else he'd be killed. Abdul pressed the gun barrel to his neck, making him repeat the line until he was satisfied. Then the captor left, leaving Alan on the floor. The journalist writhed in pain, yet was surprised at how quickly the fierce burning in his leg began to subside. He chalked it up to adrenaline, though deep down he sensed something was off with his body. Several hours later, a slender man descended into the basement. His keyring jingled softly as he studied Alan with a calm gaze. This was Malik, Abdul's partner. He was carrying a metal bowl filled with water. Kneeling down, he offered Alan a few sips. Alan coughed, struggling to swallow with his parched throat. Malik didn't look like a sadist. He didn't shout insults or strike him. He examined Alan's wound, peeling back the grimy bandages with a shake of his head. Then he asked if Alan needed a proper dressing. Alan nodded. Malik stepped out and returned with bandages and a dirty alcoholic solution. He poured it over the wound, bandaged it in haste, but never fully untied Alan's hands. His voice was quiet as he said, "Abdul wants you alive, so he won't let you die. But you'd better not give him a reason." Alan asked about Kazim. Malik glanced toward the door and replied that he didn't know if the guide was still alive, because Abdul had taken him away for questioning. After a short pause, Malik added that some American editorial offices were supposed to pay for Alan's release. If the money didn't come through, Abdul had other ways of proving he meant business. When Malik went back upstairs, Alan noticed his empty sheath. Perhaps Malik didn't want to appear hostile. In any case, Alan understood that Abdul was officially the one in charge. Being left alone with Abdul meant subjecting himself to more pointless violence. Alan tried to move his arms behind his back. The ropes pressed into his wrists, hindering circulation. He felt a slight tingling in his leg, yet the wound was bleeding far less than he would have expected. His thoughts were muddled, and he desperately wanted to find some way to call for help. After a while, the door opened again. Abdul returned with the camera and ordered Alan to stand before the lens. He demanded that the hostage repeat the plea for $1 million, this time adding the threat that if payment wasn't made, the American swine would face a slow death. Alan was forced to recite the script. A mixture of fury and humiliation tightened inside him. His pulse pounded in his ears, and his eyes kept closing from exhaustion and sweat. After filming, Abdul slammed him in the shoulder with his rifle stock, warning him not to lie and bellowing that any delay with the money will cost the prisoner another injury. He showed a knife and ran it across Alan's arm, leaving a shallow cut. When Abdul finally left, the journalist collapsed onto his side, thinking about how to escape. Dark thoughts crept in. Maybe he should just try to flee, even if it meant dying on the run. but the wound in his leg kept him from moving freely. He wasn't sure if he could even make it over the threshold. It felt like a hopeless captivity, and Alan realized all he could do was wait for Abdul's next sadistic outburst. At one point, he noticed the cut on his arm had stopped bleeding heavily after only a few minutes, and the pain wasn't as bad as it should have been. Fear prickled inside him. Such rapid healing was unnatural, but he was afraid to search for answers. Maybe it was a lingering effect of the old wolf bite. He remembered how that mysterious animal had vanished, leaving injuries that healed faster than normal. That night, Alan couldn't sleep. The basement began to feel like a graveyard, with him lying among ghosts. The air was damp, and the floor covered in sand and tiny debris. His leg throbbed, but the pain wasn't crippling. From somewhere above, he heard footsteps. Probably Abdul pacing back and forth, waiting for a chance to negotiate. The journalist wanted to call out for Malik to ask about Kazim, yet he didn't dare shout. Only a faint hiss escaped his lips when he tried to sit up. The captivity dragged on, and any hope of miraculous rescue was dwindling. Alan woke early in the morning with the distinct feeling that the chains around his wrists had loosened a bit. Perhaps they had slackened overnight, or maybe someone had loosened them on purpose. He touched his thigh where the bullet wound had been, and felt a thick scar that was almost no longer painful. Cautiously, he tried to keep still so no one would hear him, but the door squeaked open. Abdul entered, glaring at Alan and spotting that the ropes weren't as tight. Hissing with anger, he grabbed the chain and yanked it violently, nearly crushing Alan's wrist. He poured out a stream of curses, screaming that if he ever saw Alan attempting to free himself again, he'd cut off the journalist's hand. Before long, Malik came down. His gaze flicked from Alan to Abdul, and the two gunmen started arguing. Abdul yelled that Malik was acting like a soft fool and didn't grasp that they needed to extract information from the hostage by any means. Malik replied that they shouldn't push the hostage so far that he died before they got the ransom. Abdul cursed him out, kicked some empty crates, and brandished his pistol. Alan realized a conflict was building between the two. Once Abdul left, Malik leaned over to Alan, touched his arm, and said he hadn't tied him as tightly, knowing the journalist was already at his limit. Alan whispered a plea for help. He told Malik that Abdul would never give him a fair share if the money came in. Malik sighed and listened, but gave no clear answer. He picked up the blood-stained bandages and left, closing the door quietly. Alan remained still, hoping his words had planted doubts in Malik's mind about Abdul. A day passed, heavy with silence and unease. By evening, Malik returned, bringing a clean rag for bandaging and a small piece of dry food. Alan devoured the bread but hardly tasted any salt or sourness, as though his senses had gone numb. Malik asked if it was strange that the journalist looked stronger than someone should after so many injuries. Alan didn't know how to respond. He merely shrugged and whispered, "That's how it is." Malik shook his head and said such a person might be worth more than $1 million. Alan felt a surge of anxiety. If his unusual condition became too obvious, Abdul might find an even more sadistic use for him. Late that night, Alan made a desperate move to escape. He strained at his bonds, noticing rust had weakened one part of the chain. He rocked back and forth until he heard the metal creak. With a sudden yank, he freed one hand, then jerked at the second rope. But at that moment, Abdul burst into the basement holding his pistol. He shouted he would kill the American bastard if he made another move. The rifle butt struck Alan's temple, and he crashed to the floor. Abdul stomped on his wounded leg and threatened to carve it up with his knife. Hearing the commotion, Malik rushed downstairs and tried to pull Abdul off. Another argument erupted between them. Abdul struck Malik with the rifle, accusing him of sympathizing with the enemy. Only half conscious, Alan watched them rage at each other. He realized his only hope was for the two men to fully turn on one another. He just had to keep fanning the flames of their discord. Next time Malik appeared, Alan whispered that Abdul was bluffing about splitting the money. He insisted that Abdul was a sadist who would probably get rid of any witnesses. Malik looked unsettled, but kept listening without interruption. He admitted he'd long doubted Abdul's loyalty. Alan felt a crack widening between them. Shots rang out somewhere outside, perhaps a skirmish nearby, or maybe another group settling its own scores. Abdul rushed into the basement, furious, tossing his weapon onto the floor. He said he'd made contact with the clients about the ransom. He'd raised the demand, hoping any delay would give him time for more intimidation tactics. Malik scowled, asking why Abdul hadn't consulted him. Abdul laughed derisively and said Malik was nobody. From where Alan lay in the corner, he could sense the tension mounting between the captors. When Abdul stepped out for a moment, Malik again bent down beside Alan and asked if there was any way to contact the editorial office directly, bypassing Abdul. The journalist answered that he could supply the necessary phone numbers if Malik would give him just 1 minute with any device. Malik looked toward the door and said he'd think about it. He left Alan a bit of water, glanced at the almost clotted blood on the bandages, and said nothing, even though his eyes betrayed a hint of amazement. Then he stepped out, shutting the door behind him. Alone once more, Alan felt along the chipped edge of the concrete floor, trying to break off a fragment he could use as a makeshift blade to cut through his ropes. The pain in his leg was less intense. Something inside him, some odd regeneration, was helping him recover. He had little idea what was coming next, but he sensed that time was against him. If Abdul lost patience, he could simply shoot the hostage. Meanwhile, the simmering clash between the captors might be his only key to escape. Alan awoke to the first gray light seeping into the basement. He struggled to focus, his forehead beaded with sweat. All night, he'd been plagued by nightmares of that wild wolf sinking its teeth into his neck once again. In the dream, the wolf grew to human size, transforming into a giant figure with lupine features, whispering, "Embrace what's inside you." Alan saw the dark forest just miles from the highway where his tragedy had happened. He woke several times to find that the pain from his most recent wounds was fading. The gashes on his leg and shoulder seemed to be healing at an unnaturally rapid pace. By daybreak, Abdul stomped in, seething with irritation. He kicked Alan, slammed the gun handle against him, and snarled that the ransom hadn't arrived, and that they'd have to wait a few more days for some mediator to get in touch. He fired a shot near Alan's foot to scare him, shouting that he could end it any time with a bullet to the head. Alan figured Abdul wouldn't kill him just yet, since the money might still come through. But fear still clawed at his mind. Suddenly, Malik entered, trying to stop Abdul by pointing out it wasn't in their best interest to push the hostage to the brink of death. Abdul lashed out, accusing Malik of going soft, insisting he cared more about the stranger than their own operation. He added that if no ransom came, they would carve up the hostage and dump him outside. Abdul stormed off, slamming the door. Malik lingered long enough to toss Alan a canteen of water. He gave a quick look at the journalist's wounds, marveling that Alan was still conscious. His eyes darted nervously as he lifted the edge of Alan's shirt, noticing the bruises were already starting to fade. Malik remarked that he didn't believe it himself, but apparently this man was staying on his feet longer than any mortal could after such beatings. When Malik went back upstairs, Alan propped himself up on an elbow and felt around the bandages. He couldn't explain why his muscles behaved as if he'd had weeks of recovery. His head no longer spun, and only the scratch near his collarbone reminded him of where Abdul's bullet had lodged not long ago. Later in the evening, Alan made a bold attempt. Malik came down alone and got distracted rummaging through a crate by the wall. Seizing the moment, Alan tensed his arms and jerked free of the slackened ropes, which had weakened further since the previous night. He grabbed the pistol at Malik's side, aiming at the door, poised to run. But as soon as he made a dash for the exit, his bullet-scorched leg gave way. He lost his balance, crashed into an overturned table, and dropped the weapon. Malik reacted instantly, striking Alan on the temple with the flat of his hand. The gun clattered onto the concrete floor. Just then, Abdul burst in from the hallway, knife in hand, raging. The two of them wrestled Alan to the ground and tied his arms behind him again. Abdul roared that he'd slice off whatever he pleased. He injected something into Alan's shoulder, most likely a sedative mixed with God knows what, to keep him from dying too quickly. Alan felt icy fire surge through his veins, and his vision blurred. His consciousness dipped in and out of a nightmarish haze. When he finally came to, Malik was carefully dressing his fresh wounds. Abdul stood off to the side, glaring at Alan as though deciding whether to kill him right then and there. Malik muttered that anyone else would already be dead from the blood loss. He waved a hand, indicating to Abdul that they needed to negotiate again. A pointless bloodbath wouldn't profit them. Abdul spat on the floor and left, promising he'd strip more than just the clothes off the American next time. Alone with Alan, Malik muttered in disgust, "Apparently you're not an ordinary man." He went on to say he'd seen how the journalist healed too fast, that these wounds should have finished him off by now. Alan managed only to say he didn't understand why he was still alive. But deep down, he remembered the wolf's bite and how doctors had marveled at his rapid healing. He recalled the strange aggression that plagued him afterward. Now, here in this hellish cellar, his body seemed to manifest that power he'd been afraid to acknowledge. Toward evening, Malik went upstairs, leaving Alan in the darkness, drifting in a half-sleepless stupor. Once again, the same dream seared through his mind. A towering werewolf urging him to act. Alan saw his own hand covered in tufts of fur. He tried to wake, screaming, and heard an animalistic growl rise from within. When he finally opened his eyes, he patted himself down and realized the nightmare hadn't become reality. Yet with every touch of moonlight, his body responded with a feverish jolt. Abdul spent the morning setting up another video session. He positioned the camera, forcing Alan to feign desperation and repeat a new script demanding not $1 but $2 million. The gunman seemed drunk on the prospect of profit, and the process itself clearly excited his brutal nature. When they finished filming, he fired several shots near Alan's feet, yelling he'd send the footage to the people with the money. Malik, watching from the sidelines, occasionally objected, saying this sudden jump in ransom could scare off potential mediators. Abdul rounded on him and snarled that he was in charge, and Malik shouldn't dare interfere. After they left, Alan took a shaky breath and pulled himself against the wall, trying not to dwell on the chest pain left by the rifle butt. One thought kept circling in his mind. How many times would Abdul raise the ransom before he realized the risk of losing the hostage was growing? Malik returned later, untying one of Alan's hands so he could drink. Alan noticed the exhausted look in Malik's eyes. Quietly, Malik said, "Abdul's lost his head, and I don't want to end up with nothing." Alan gazed at him in desperation. "You really think he'll pay you your cut?" Malik didn't reply, but doubt flickered in his expression. Alan pressed on. "If Abdul can shoot me at any moment, he won't spare you either." Malik gave a tense shrug, muttering that he had no other plan. That same evening, Alan managed to overhear the gunman's conversation. Abdul was complaining about problems with suppliers and warning that rival squads might show up soon. Instead of being worried, he seemed thrilled at the prospect of more chaos. Malik tried to reason with him, saying, "With that attitude, we could lose everything." But Abdul snapped back, his voice tinged with an unhealthy excitement. It seemed his sadistic streak overshadowed any semblance of logic. Malik backed off, but fear simmered in his eyes. Alan realized this clash of personalities might be his best chance. That night, when Malik paid another visit, Alan spoke up. "You know, the place where Abdul stabbed me with the knife healed over in just one day." Malik asked if the journalist was delirious. Alan, embarrassed, sighed and tried to explain why he was still alive. He added that at one point he'd been bitten by something mysterious. Malik listened, and a flicker of superstition crossed his face. He wondered aloud if this meant regular weapons wouldn't harm the hostage. Alan didn't give a direct answer, but hinted that the bullets had nearly killed him. Yet here he was, still breathing. Malik recoiled as though frightened, and yet his desire for profit intermingled with curiosity about this invulnerability. Alan seized the moment to repeat that Abdul would never share the ransom money, and that Malik could hand the journalist over to some official authority in exchange for safe passage. Malik heaved a troubled sigh, muttering that he feared Abdul's wrath. Unaware of these basement conversations, Abdul kept recording new sadistic clips. He beat Alan, stole the last crumbs of his food, and tormented him by yanking his hair. Each time Abdul derived a twisted satisfaction, and between sessions he would ask Malik, "You want to make some money too, don't you?" Malik nodded but avoided looking him in the eye. A quiet fear gnawed at him. Abdul seemed close to madness, and the hostage was still alive, as though sustained by some dark power. One evening, Malik approached Alan quietly, knelt beside him, and asked flat out, "Could you survive if he put a bullet in your head?" Alan mumbled that he didn't know, but he felt something stir inside him whenever moonlight appeared. Malik turned pale, then said, "Abdul may snap tomorrow." Alan offered a solution. "Hand me over to the authorities or take me far away and run. It's better than dying alongside him. Malik stood up without a word and left. The next morning, after toying with the camera again, Abdul accused Malik of not being cruel enough. He claimed Malik was befriending the American and suggested it was time to test Malik's loyalty. The tension between them flared up again. Abdul's voice rose, turning to shouts and curses. Alan was sure that sooner or later Abdul would decide to get rid of his partner, who was wavering too much. All the journalist could do was wait for the hostilities to reach a point of no return. Meanwhile, his own disturbing dreams consumed him. During one brief rest, he again saw himself among wolves chasing down prey. He woke with clenched fists and a pounding heart, staring at the dimly lit basement. A cold desire to fight had begun stirring within him, even with his bare hands if he had to. He sensed that the approaching full moon would trigger something he dreaded to think about. On the last evening before the full moon, moonlight slanted through a narrow, high window. Alan felt a surge of heat throughout his body. Sweat beaded on his forehead and his breathing turned ragged. He tried not to focus on the silvery glow, but it drew his gaze. His body seemed on the verge of revolt, his muscles quivering. He realized another night in this basement might lead to something highly unusual. Whether that cursed ability would save him or doom him, he had no idea. All he could do was wait for the conflict between Abdul and Malik to ignite anew. The evening began with the sounds of a quarrel, which echoed down to the basement. Leaning against the wall, Alan heard Abdul's furious voice, insults, and pained groaning. From the sound of it, the gunmen were grappling on the other side of the door. He heard footsteps pounding on the stairs, crates toppling, then a piercing gunshot. The door burst open, and in the doorway stood Abdul, nearly deranged. Blood darkened the sleeve of his jacket. He took a sharp stride toward Alan, clutching a pistol as though prepared to shoot him on the spot. At that instant, Malik barreled through the door again. He had been hit by a bullet. Blood trickled down his arm, and he raised his own pistol to aim at Abdul. Abdul dodged, and the two opened fire at each other. Bullets ricocheted off metal crates and concrete walls. Alan ducked low, doing his best to avoid a stray shot. He caught sight of a round scraping Abdul's cheek, leaving a bloody trail, and another wounding Malik's shoulder. But neither man let up. They darted through the cramped corridor, each trying to finish the other. Slipping on debris, Malik fell to his knees. Seeing this, Abdul snarled and charged. He managed to pull a knife and slash Malik's side. Malik howled and tried to lift his pistol, but Abdul kicked the weapon away. Raising the knife high, he drove it into Malik's body several times, cursing aloud. Blood gushed onto the floor, and Malik choked for breath, looking toward Alan. Abdul, lips twisted in a mad grin, seized Malik by the hair and in a single vicious motion slashed his throat. He didn't stop there. In a frenzied determination, he practically severed the head, almost savoring the butchery. A harsh, metallic stench filled the corridor. Alan watched in horror, knowing Malik stood no chance. Covered in blood, Abdul cast a look toward the basement. He walked in, still gripping the bloody knife, dragging what remained of Malik behind him. Alan watched with revulsion as the severed head slid across the concrete. Abdul hurled it at the captive's feet with a jerk of his arm. Madness gleamed in his eyes. "It's your fault, American," he screamed, his voice devoid of any sanity. He kicked Alan, knocking him to the floor, then pinned him under a wild, manic glare. He seized Alan's wounded shoulder and squeezed hard, sending a jolt of sharp pain through him. After a couple of seconds, Abdul froze. He noticed that Alan's chest bore barely any sign of his old wounds, and realized the journalist could still move despite so many injuries. Narrowing his eyes, he raised the knife as if about to plunge it into the hostage's heart. But just then, moonlight flooded in through the narrow window near the ceiling, illuminating Alan's face. The journalist felt a searing heat, like an electric shock coursing through his body. A ragged sound escaped him, his chest constricted. Abdul flinched when he saw coarse hair sprouting along Alan's arms and the rapid elongation of his nails. Alan tried to resist the transformation, but there was no stopping it. The dormant wolf within him, nourished by the moonlight, was breaking free. His muscles twisted, his bones creaked. He didn't scream words, only a roar, so bestial that even Abdul, no stranger to brutality, trembled. The ropes binding Alan snapped under the pressure of that wild force. His face elongated into a wolfish muzzle, eyes blazing with a predator's gleam. Abdul panicked and tried to reload his pistol, only to find he had just a few bullets left. One bounced off the wall, another struck the werewolf's shoulder, but failed to slow him. Alan, in werewolf form, lunged forward, knocking Abdul to the floor and sinking his claws into Abdul's chest. The man screamed, trying to drag himself away, but massive fangs tore into his shoulder. The sound of muscle ripping was sickening. Abdul's ragged cries abruptly died as he choked in mid-scream. The werewolf tore him apart, leaving bloody remains strewn across the concrete. At that moment, a large wolf appeared in the basement entrance. Two more followed, peering at the scene. They stood in a semicircle as though recognizing the werewolf as their leader. They didn't attack Alan. They simply watched, bowing their heads. When the werewolf jerked away from Abdul's corpse and turned toward them, they let out a piercing howl as if welcoming a new alpha. Consumed by bestial fury, Alan darted to the exit, and the wolves raced alongside him, leaving the mutilated remains of Abdul behind. Outside, night had settled deep. The moon hung above the ruins. Alan bounded forward, leaping over rubble. His feral form moved with uncanny speed. His muscles felt strangely unbound. He sensed no lingering pain. The pack stayed with him, as if guarding him. At some point, after covering several hundred yards past abandoned structures, Alan lost his bearings, not knowing where he was headed. He obeyed only the instinct to keep running. Rage surged in his chest, but there was also a strange sense of freedom. He felt as if he belonged to the night itself, hearing sounds he had never noticed before. Near dawn, the beastly nature began to ebb. Alan howled, feeling his bones shift again. Weakening, he collapsed, and his fur started to vanish, returning him to human form. The wolves that had clustered around him backed away, sensing their alpha was no longer a beast. They watched him with a low, mournful howl, and then melted away into the twilight. Alan tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold. His clothes hung in tatters, and his shoulders and arms were smeared with dried blood. He crawled along until he stumbled onto a road with patches of battered asphalt. Exhausted, he dropped into the dust and lost consciousness. For the first time in days, he found a sleep not dominated by fear of Abdul, and his body simply gave out. After a while, a shepherd in worn shoes came along, herding a small flock. He spotted a man lying there and approached. This was Vahid, a man with keen eyes who wasn't about to leave someone to die. He carefully turned Alan over and saw he was barely breathing, his skin cool to the touch. Vahid realized he couldn't just walk away. He gave Alan a few sips of water and tried to rouse him. Alan moaned softly, half opening his eyes, but couldn't manage a word. The shepherd hoisted him up, determined to carry him to the modest home he kept a few miles away at the edge of the ruins. Vahid hauled Alan across his shoulders, guiding the flock through the wreckage of old courtyards. He didn't understand what had happened to this stranger, but he could see the man was covered in scratches and his clothes soaked with blood. After traveling about 8 miles from the ruins, they reached a sheltered spot where Vahid had a small hut. There were clay jugs of water, some grain, and a few rough-sewn mattresses. The shepherd carefully washed Alan's face and helped him drink. Alan opened his eyes and looked around anxiously. He struggled to recall the night's events, but flashes of the bloody slaughter streaked through his mind, making him nauseous. Vahid asked him about his many wounds and the blood on his hands. In halting words, Alan spoke of being kidnapped by militants, forced to record ransom videos. He remembered how their hideout had become a scene of brutal violence, but said nothing about his transformation. Vahid pondered, noticing the stranger bore no deep wounds despite his blood-stained clothes. He decided not to press further. War in this region often birthed horrors best left unspoken. The following day, Alan stood on his own. He noticed a few lingering scars, but most of the pain had subsided. Vahid offered him some food, a piece of flatbread and dried meat, and explained that nearby they'd found 2 corpses bearing horrendous injuries, as though torn apart by animals. Alan knew it must be the same place where he had left Abdul's mutilated remains. But he kept silent. He couldn't tell the shepherd that a werewolf inside him had caused the night's carnage. He felt ashamed and terrified, still unable to grasp how any of it was possible. Seeing Alan's hands trembling as he tried to hold a cup of water, Vahid guessed that the man had suffered a severe shock and needed shelter. He added that he could guide Alan toward the federal checkpoints if he needed to leave the area. He mentioned hidden paths that few militants used. Alan agreed, though he was afraid someone else might discover his secret. He wasn't sure he wouldn't transform again at any moment. They walked for almost 2 days, stopping among the ruins of small villages. Vahid asked few questions, talking only about how the war had robbed local people of their normal lives. He said he remained a shepherd because nobody needed him except the sheep. Alan listened quietly, recalling how he'd risked everything coming here for a story. He felt guilt for ignoring his wife's warnings. Sometimes he awoke in the night, straining to see wolfish silhouettes in the darkness, but saw only Vahid's flock slumbering peacefully nearby. After 2 days, they emerged into a relatively safe area where federal patrols were occasionally seen. Vahid said that from here, Alan could manage on his own. It would be easier to find a vehicle and slip away under a false name. Alan thanked the shepherd and tried to give him some large bills, but Vahid refused, saying, "You've already paid in blood." A note of compassion sounded in his voice. He looked at Alan with a solemn understanding, as if he knew more than he let on. With the help of a fellow reporter, Alan made it to an airport and eventually left Russia. Getting back to Nevada took longer than expected, as he had to avoid too many questions about what happened in Chechnya. He turned everything over in his mind: the captivity, the savagery, his regeneration, the moonlit transformation. Sitting in the plane, gazing out the window, he remembered how Abdul and Malik had been consumed by their own madness. He thought about Vahid's quiet rescue, free of probing questions. But most of all, he worried about the unknown part of his nature that had awakened under that Chechen moon. Upon returning to Nevada, Alan tried to keep a low profile. He showed up at his doorstep late at night, when his wife was already asleep. Betty woke at the creak of the front door and rushed into the hallway. She saw her husband, gaunt and with a haunted expression, though his body bore hardly any fresh wounds. Alan didn't hurry to tell the truth. He only said he'd been taken by militants and freed under strange circumstances. Betty didn't press him for details, knowing all the horrors he'd witnessed. A few days later, brief news reports mentioned the American journalist returning from Chechnya. They noted that the kidnappers had been found dead under mysterious circumstances, apparently victims of a wolf attack. Speculation arose about infighting between gang factions. No one managed to piece it all together. Alan read these notes and realized official channels had closed the case, calling it one more shock of war. His own paper asked for an interview, but he refused. Management didn't insist, conceding that the journalist deserved time to recover in private. Though Betty was relieved he was alive, their reunion was fraught. She barely recognized her husband. He often spent nights awake, sitting by the window and staring at the sky. Whenever the moon rose over the city, Alan shuddered, as if recalling something horrific. A couple of times, Betty caught him leaving the house in a half-conscious state in the middle of the night. At dawn, she'd find him close by, barefoot and disheveled, as though he'd been roaming in the woods. Alan couldn't explain what was happening. He only felt that the beast within him hadn't vanished with those Chechen memories. Official investigations went nowhere. No one demanded detailed reports from Alan. A few colleagues tried asking him about the dead Abdul and his partner, but he replied evasively, citing severe exhaustion. The documents he'd brought back from Chechnya remained tucked away, unpublished. He couldn't bear to delve into the horrors of captivity, nor could he share them without revealing his monstrous secret. One day, Betty found Alan in the backyard, digging into the ground with his bare hands. His eyes were distant, and he didn't notice her approach. She called his name and saw that his nails were smeared with blood. Alan snapped out of it, dropping a clump of wet earth, unable to offer any explanation. He was clearly terrified of his own actions. From that day on, Betty nearly stopped asking questions. She sensed that what was happening to him went far beyond normal psychological trauma. By the month's end, Alan tried to behave more like his old self, but the sleepless nights persisted. He avoided unnecessary social contact, constantly replaying scenes from the Chechen basement in his mind, and that moment the moon changed his body. He could no longer dismiss the idea of a werewolf as mere legend. He'd seen the proof on his own skin, felt it in his pain. It was now his burden to bear. Officially, the case was closed. The Chechen militants were dead, no ransom was paid, and the hostage was saved. Records mentioned a wolf pack supposedly mauling the kidnappers. Technically, Alan had returned to ordinary life, yet every evening he stared at the sky and sensed something wild within. An echo of that night's growl lingered, reminding him that the beast still lived inside him. He knew that sooner or later the next full moon would call to him again.